Member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. This bill, of course, amends the Australian Education Act 2013 to require that the Minister be satisfied that a state or territory will not reduce or has not reduced its education budget before making a determination of Commonwealth school funding to that state or territory. In simple terms, what this means is the states and territories can't take funding out the back door as the Commonwealth increases funding in the front door. Before the election, Tony Abbott promised a unity ticket with Labor on schools funding, but of course we see now another broken promise. What we see here is legislation designed to ensure that states are not decreasing education funding. Before the election, the Labor then government did a lot of work to come up with a fair funding model for Australian schools, and along with that fair funding model for Australian schools, we made a commitment to a substantial extra investment in schools, $14.65 billion over 6 years. That $14.65 billion, of course, included Commonwealth funding, and it also included state funding. For every $2 that we were putting in, we expected the states to put in an extra $1. Before the election, you first of all had the Christopher Pyne at the time as the opposition spokesperson saying, absolutely not, over my dead body, no Gonski, no way are we supporting this funding model. And what became apparent as the election campaign progressed was how terribly unpopular that position was, because Australian parents of both public and private school kids understand that the quality of our education system depends on every child in every community, in every family, in every school, having an opportunity to get the best possible education. Parents know that they want their own kids to get the very best education, but they know that for the cohesion of our society and the strength of our economy, that all kids need to get a decent education. So very strong support for the Gonski school education funding reforms. Coalition drag kicking and screaming to saying that they're on a unity ticket with Labor, but then what happens afterwards? Under this government, Commonwealth funding drops to just $2.8 billion over 4 years instead of the $14.65 billion combined Commonwealth state funding over 6 years I mentioned earlier. And the states, of course, don't need to put in a single extra dollar. In fact, they can cut funding from their own education budgets and still get the small amount of extra Commonwealth funding in comparison to what was previously on offer. The reason that we went into the complexity of our school education funding system is because every child in Australia deserves a decent education. But just as importantly, our national prosperity depends on every Australian child getting a top quality education. So it wasn't just $14.65 billion of extra funding for our schools that was important, but also better quality teaching, higher standards, better training, support and development for teachers, better student outcomes, focusing on more individual attention for every student, more flexibility for principals, engaging with parents and the community. And I'm actually a particularly strong supporter of more flexibility for principals. I think principals know their school communities and they know what their kids need in their schools, and they're dedicated to achieving that. So I'm a big supporter of more flexibility for principals. A needs-based funding system, so every child in every school gets a good education. And transparency and accountability. Transparency and accountability were controversial measures. We were criticised, including by some teachers, for the demand that we instituted for greater transparency and accountability, for national testing like NAPLAN, and for the transparency of the My School website. But I make no apology for those measures either. We saw on the weekend a list of most improved schools that included some very surprising names. We only know that because we've got NAPLAN and the school transparency measures. In the end, I have to say that this bill should not be necessary. It should not be necessary to have to hold the states to account, but we've seen terrible cuts at state and territory levels, teachers sacked, schools closed and sold off. If the Liberals were truly on a unity ticket with Labor on funding, this bill would not be necessary. It is necessary because instead of $14.65 billion, we get about a third of that under this government.